Hey everybody! I'm a sound designer, and over time I've gathered huge amounts of theoretical knowledge as well as practical experience when it comes to guns and projectiles. This ranges from shooting various guns myself to pretty much getting shot at in order to settle an internal dispute over what supersonic projectiles sound like if they impact before they can reach the listener. Long story short, I got a lot of stuff to share, and I intend this video to be the ultimate resource for understanding the various noises of gunfire and projectiles on a meaningful but not overwhelming level. So, whether you're a fellow sound designer or just someone interested in the topic, I hope you enjoy. This video will be roughly separated into 3 parts: the mechanics, the discharge, and the projectile. Oh, and a few notes. For the sake of flow, I'll use sound pressure level and noise level interchangeably, even though those two are super technically 2 different measurements. I will also be using some non-graphic war footage as reference, but solely for the purpose of showcasing the interesting sonic phenomena we'll be going over and not to glorify any of the depicted material. We'll start with the mechanics, which, on paper, are fairly simple but have some intricacies. At the core, almost all guns fire when a firing pin strikes the primer of a cartridge in the gun's chamber, igniting the cartridge's gunpowder and pushing the projectile out of the barrel. For semi- or fully automatic guns, additional mechanisms ready the gun for the next round or continue firing. In short, firing a gun involves striking a cartridge, often followed by prepping for the next shot. Manual guns, like bolt-action rifles, are the simplest. Pulling the trigger just makes the firing pin hit the cartridge. While this action produces a sound, it's negligible compared to the gun's actual discharge. Semi-automatic pistols are a bit more interesting. When the trigger is pulled, the hammer strikes the firing pin, which in turn strikes the primer of the cartridge, causing the slide to move back, either from pressure or a gas system. As it moves, the spent casing is ejected and a new cartridge is pushed up from the magazine. On its return, the slide chambers the new cartridge, readying the pistol to fire again. This rapid, forceful movement of the slide, especially when it stops abruptly, produces a noticeable sound. Semi-automatic rifles and machine guns are where things get even more interesting. In general, we have to differentiate between guns that fire from an open bolt and guns that fire from a closed bolt. The bolt, in a way, is somewhat akin to the slide of a pistol. It loads cartridges into the chamber, locks the chamber during firing, and ejects them after the shot. Most modern assault rifles, like the M16 or AK-74, operate from a closed bolt. This means that, when ready to fire, a cartridge is chambered, the hammer is cocked, and the bolt locks the chamber. When the trigger is pulled, the hammer strikes the firing pin, igniting the cartridge. Many rifles use a gas system, redirecting some of the gases from the barrel to operate the bolt. The bolt moves back, ejects the spent cartridge, and loads a new one. This motion is similar to a pistol, but the bolt is heavier, causing a distinct, loud sound due to the rapid back and forth movement. Open bolt designs are similar to closed bolt ones, but have some key differences. In the fire-ready position, the bolt is held back, leaving the chamber open and empty, which helps to keep it cool. This is why most machine guns operate from an open bolt. When the trigger is pulled, the sear releases the bolt, allowing it to snap forward, chamber a cartridge, and fire it. From a sound perspective, the key aspect is that the gun doesn't fire immediately when pulling the trigger. The bolt has to move forward first. This movement is clearly audible and can even be seen in close-up recordings. The sound is especially noticeable in larger machine guns with heavier bolts. And even high-caliber, vehicle-mounted autocannons. There are many factors that influence the overall sound characteristics of a gun's mechanics. The material of the rifle, size of the bolt, the speed it moves at, and, at times, even some resonance of the gun's body itself. So motors are a great example for this. While the mechanics are usually way quieter than the actual discharge of a gun, They are still decently loud on their own, and especially the bolt snapping back can oftentimes be heard quite clearly when firing. Moving on to the big boom, the actual discharge of the gun, resulting from firing the cartridge. Let's get something out of the way first. Guns are loud. Like, really, really loud. If you've never heard actual gunfire, chances are you're completely underestimating just how ear-piercing even small caliber firearms are. Describing it can only do so much, but let's get some bearings. A regular conversation has a sound pressure level, or SPL, of roughly 50 decibels, give or take. A 9mm pistol has an SPL of around 160 decibels. This difference doesn't seem too large at first, only 3 times as loud, right? Well, that is until we factor in that every increase of 6 decibels results in a doubling of sound pressure. Our difference of 110 decibels therefore means a 9mm discharge is actually roughly 315,000 times more intense than a conversation at 50 decibels. That's a lot. It's also 32 times more intense than the so-called pain threshold of around 130 decibels. Every sound above the pain threshold we are exposed to causes immediate physical pain and near guaranteed hearing damage if endured for extended periods. It is noteworthy that our loudness perception and sound pressure don't quite correlate. While 6 decibels double sound intensity, it is generally agreed upon that we need a volume increase of roughly 10 decibels in order to perceive a sound as twice as loud. However, that would still mean that the 9mm shot is perceived to be around 2050 times louder than a conversation at 50 decibels. Because of these huge noise levels, gunshots can be heard over extremely large distances. Typical audible distances for small caliber pistols and rifles range from 1 to 3 kilometers, though much longer audible ranges are possible depending on the weather and environment. Okay, now comes the moment we've all been waiting for. This here is a recording of a gunshot. But not just any recording, it is a recording that caught most of the so-called dynamic range of the discharge, meaning the difference between the loudest and quietest part. Are you ready? Really? Okay, brace yourselves. Now, that was underwhelming, wasn't it? Didn't we just talk about how violently loud gunshots are? Well, yes, but there is a fundamental catch, or actually, multiple ones. First and foremost, listening to an isolated recording or sound is meaningless and doesn't tell us much about how loud something is. We've just experienced it. I played back a gunshot recording, but it was quieter than my voice. And there is a good reason why the gunshot recording was this quiet. Without getting into too much detail, there is a clearly defined technical volume limit in digital audio, called 0 dBFS. All we need to know right now is that this limit cannot be exceeded, otherwise the audio is basically cut off and becomes a distorted mess. This means that we want the whole amplitude of the gunshot to fit within the digital audio range. In order to do so, we need to reduce the recording gain of our audio recorder. Or, to give a more visual example, imagine that we want to take a picture of a person from a distance so that they just fill out the monitor. And now we want to take a picture of a large tower. In order to fit the whole tower into the frame, we need to increase the distance to it. Now, both the person and the tower take in roughly the same space in the picture, even though the tower as a physical object is of course larger than the person. And since I can already hear my sound designer friends typing, yes, there is 32-bit float recording, I know. Let's have a closer look at the recording. From afar, it looks as if it's basically just a single peak and nothing else. That is because the actual discharge sound is caused by the gases explosively leaving the gun's barrel and, upon doing so, rapidly expanding and dispersing. This all happens almost instantaneously, and this is what we see in the recording. This is an absolutely critical thing to understand when it comes to gunshot noise, and I can't stress this enough. The actual shot or discharge sound is basically just an incredibly short burst of energy, barely lasting a few milliseconds. An impulse. Everything else that we associate with a typical gunshot sound is actually just the environment reflecting this initial discharge noise around. This in turn means that what the overall gunshot sounds like to us is almost 100% influenced by the environment the gun was fired in and, when up close, maybe some audible mechanics. A gun fired indoors sounds completely different than one fired in a mountainous area. Or, to be more precise, the different environments simply reflect the gunshot's impulse differently. A great smaller scale example to showcase this is comparing what a balloon pop sounds like in a reverberating room versus an anechoic chamber. Let's use this opportunity to talk about the differences in sound between different guns. Pop culture and video games in particular have established a common understanding that each gun has a very distinct sound. But that isn't really the case. As we've just discussed, aside from some mechanical noise, the actual discharge is really just an insanely loud, insanely short pop. Everything else is the sound, specifically the discharge noise, reflecting off the environment. The major difference between most guns is really just a difference in loudness and pitch of the discharge. Before we go into more detail, it is important to understand that what we call sound is not a physical object, but simply energy moving through the air as vibrations. These vibrations, in turn, happen because something is giving off the energy in the first place. For gunfire, this is the gases that propel the bullet forward and then rapidly expand once they leave the barrel, in turn giving off energy as sound. The total amount of available initial energy is determined by the gunpowder within the cartridge, and therefore equal for all guns when using the same ammunition. This also means that larger ammunition with a higher amount of gunpowder has more potential to be louder than smaller ammunition with less gunpowder. Almost all the magic, however, happens inside the gun's barrel. Once the round goes off, the gases build up an immense pressure inside the barrel, which propels the bullet forward. A key aspect to understand here is that the gases constantly transfer their own energy into the bullet. Simply put, the longer the barrel, the more time there is for the energy of the gases to be transferred into the projectile. Additionally, a longer barrel also allows the gases to expand more before exiting the gun. So, with increasing barrel length, the overall noise level and pitch of the discharge will therefore drop, as the gases emerge with less pressure. This in turn means that shorter barrels leave less time for the gases to expand and transfer their energy to the bullet, resulting in a louder and higher pitched shot as the gases emerge with more pressure. This is why carbine versions of assault rifles are oftentimes louder and sound sharper than their full-barreled siblings. And we are not talking about a small difference here. Measurements show that shorter barrels can result in an increase of close to 6 decibels, meaning a near doubling of sound pressure. In a recent video of Demolition Ranch, they fired a .556 caliber gun with an insanely short barrel. And indeed, this was one of the first comments.
I can hear it on that one. When I shoot this big steel, I can't even hear it hitting. This is so loud.
This also puts us on the track for understanding how suppressors influence the discharge noise. The goal of a suppressor is to make the gases leave the gun with less pressure and less rapidly, so that less energy is going off as sound and over a longer amount of time. This is achieved by constructing the inside of suppressors in ways that give the gases time and space to expand and basically slow down a bit before they exit the gun, resulting in a quieter bang with a lower pitch. This more gradual and prolonged escape of the gases can also result in a slight hissing sound. A common comparison to showcase the principle is a balloon. When stabbing it with a needle, it gives off a loud pop as the pressurized air inside is being released all at once. When slowly releasing the air, however, it's not nearly as loud. You might now say, but wait, I've listened to recordings of suppressed weapons and they actually sound brighter. That is technically true, but not because the discharge itself becomes brighter. Rather, the quieter discharge allows for the high-pitched supersonic boom of the projectile to come through more. We'll talk about this later. It's noteworthy that suppressors can yield surprising results for smaller calibers that have a relatively low energy, such as .22 long rifle, to a point where the mechanics almost become the loudest part.
105.3.
The story changes the larger the caliber becomes, however. While the noise reduction is still immense, a suppressed .556 caliber rifle using subsonic ammunition usually measures in at between 110 and 130 decibels, which is still close to the pain threshold and as loud as some jet engines, if only for a split second. But suppressors are not the only muzzle attachments that can theoretically slightly alter the sound a bit. Any muzzle attachment that allows the gases to spread out a bit more before fully exiting the gun will result in a slightly lower noise level and pitch, though this will be almost negligible in most cases. Another noteworthy potential contributor to the reduction in gas pressure can be the gas piston systems of some guns, which redirect some of the gases in order to cycle the bolt. I say potential contributor because I couldn't find reliable sources on how much of the gases is actually being redirected. Now, let's have a look at why guns with a larger caliber tend to produce louder, more low-pitched sounds. As we have discussed earlier, larger calibers usually contain more gunpowder, thus increasing the overall potential energy available. And this is the primary reason why a larger caliber usually results in a louder weapon. More stuff that goes boom results in a louder boom. All the principles we have talked about before apply. A bit more interesting is the aspect of pitch, though. Aside from the volume difference, one of the most noticeable differences between caliber sizes is a difference in pitch. Let's compare, for example, a 9mm, 7.62mm and a 50 BMG shot to each other. It is a common misconception that larger calibers create a lower pitch discharge sound due to the increased energy. Think about it. We previously discussed that more energy released at the same time generally results in a higher pitched sound. It is actually primarily due to the larger diameter of the barrel, or bore. The larger the diameter of the bore, the more space the gases have to expand, and the larger the area from which the gases can finally exit the barrel and rapidly disperse. This results in a slower change in pressure and allows for the creation of vibrations with a lower frequency. Another aspect to look or listen into are muzzle brakes. There is the common conception that muzzle brakes are loud. However, that's not technically true. We've already established that the overall energy potential is determined by the amount of gunpowder within the fired cartridge, so putting on a muzzle brake won't magically increase the amount of energy put into the environment. So, what's going on? Well, muzzle brakes usually redirect the escaping gases towards the sides or top of the barrel in order to keep the recoil more controllable. This means that the overall energy will remain the same, but it is distributed differently. Rather than primarily exiting the barrel towards the direct front, a lot of the gases will escape to the right, left, and/or top, resulting in a perceived louder, sharper noise with a slightly higher pitch when standing in these directions. Some muzzle brakes even redirect some of the gases slightly towards the back, meaning towards the shooter, which will result in a louder perceived bang when firing the gun. And don't be mistaken, the influence of a muzzle brake on sound directivity can be huge. Cal from the Precision Rifle blog measured the sound pressure to the rear and side of the same gun with different muzzle brakes. Measured from the side, the difference between no muzzle brake and the loudest one measured in at 4 decibels, which is close to 1.6 times louder. It gets even more intense when measured from the shooter's position. The difference between no muzzle brake and the loudest muzzle brake, likely with backwards facing baffles, was a whopping 13.9 decibels. That's almost 5 times as loud. This has quite major implications for the audible range of the shot when listened to from different directions. A muzzle brake with backwards facing baffles might be less pleasant for the shooter and be audible over a larger distance towards the side and back, but noticeably decreases the audible distance towards the firing direction. Okay, that was a lot of partially quite complex information, so let's summarize the discharge chapter. Weapons are loud. A regular, unsuppressed 9mm pistol can measure in at 160 decibels. That's a 315,000 times higher sound pressure level than a regular conversation. What we perceive as a gun's discharge, or bang, is the rapid expansion of gases exiting the gun's barrel after the gunpowder within the cartridge exploded. This bang is really just a high-energy impulse, barely lasting a few milliseconds. Everything else we usually associate with a gunshot noise is just the environment reflecting this impulse. The major audible differences between gunshot discharges are their loudness and pitch. The initial available energy of a gun is determined by the amount of gunpowder within the used ammunition. The longer the barrel, the quieter the discharge and lower the pitch, because there is more time for the gases to transfer their energy into the bullet. Suppressors, aka silencers, work by giving the gases room to expand and slow down, resulting in a less explosive exit out of the barrel and, in turn, a quieter, more low-pitched discharge. Guns with larger calibers usually produce louder and lower-pitched discharges, as there is more gunpowder in their cartridges, resulting in more potential energy, and their bore diameter is larger, resulting in a lower pitch. Muzzle brakes usually redirect a part of the emerging gases, resulting in a different distribution of the energy. To conclude this chapter, I want to note that I've mainly used pistols and rifles as examples. Everything we discussed, however, translates to larger guns as well, be it mortars or tank and artillery cannons. Alrighty, time to move on to what to me is the most interesting topic: projectile noises. Be it a small bullet, an artillery shell, or even a bomb. The way they sound is all created equally, even though they might sound very different. I have the feeling that projectile noise is one of the least known and understood topics, even amongst regular shooters and veterans. In this chapter, we'll go over and also listen to pretty much every important aspect of it. We'll start by looking at subsonic projectiles, meaning projectiles that move slower than the speed of sound. I guess almost everyone has heard the typical bullet whoosh or whizz in movies. And it indeed oftentimes comes somewhat close to what an actual subsonic bullet sounds like. Here, let's have a listen at an actual recording. But where does that sound come from in the first place? Why does it sound like that? On the fundamental level, everything that moves through air is pushing the air aside. Air molecules ahead of the object are compressed, creating a region of high pressure, while a region of low pressure trails behind it. These alternating pressures are what primarily creates the sound. You can even try it out right now by just quickly wagging your hand around. Chances are it will create a slight whooshing noise. As the object moves faster, it displaces more air in a shorter amount of time, in turn creating stronger and more intense pressure waves, leading to a louder sound. Additionally, the pressure waves are created more rapidly, resulting in a higher perceived pitch. Another fundamental element is the so-called Doppler effect. The Doppler effect causes objects that move towards us to have a higher pitch than objects that move away from us. And one of the most common examples is a police car or ambulance driving by with its siren on. The explanation for it is actually somewhat straightforward. Without getting into too much detail, the shorter the wavelength of a sound is, the higher its perceived pitch. We already discussed that the projectile displaces and compresses the air in front of it. This compression causes a shortening of the sound waves, resulting in a higher pitch. The low pressure area at the back, in turn, kinda stretches and elongates the sound waves, resulting in a lower pitch. As the object passes us, we switch from hearing the higher pitched waves to the front to hearing the lower pitched waves in the object's trail. So far, all of this translates to the following. A projectile creates a sound, usually a whoosh, by displacing air and creating a high pressure area to the front and a low pressure area to its rear. The faster the projectile, the louder the sound and the higher the pitch, which is why smaller caliber bullets have a characteristic high-pitched swish or whizz. Additionally, the Doppler effect causes the projectile to have a higher pitch when it approaches us and then rapidly drop in pitch once it passes us. But there's more to it. The pitch, loudness, and overall timbre of the sound can change quite a bit depending on factors such as the projectile shape, surface, and movement. Smaller caliber bullets are usually very similar in shape and relative size, resulting in a similar sound. But it gets a lot more interesting when we start looking at things like rockets, mortars, and bombs. Let's first check if what we've learned so far still applies when listening to a passing artillery shell. And indeed, we hear a whooshy noise with a high pitch from the projectile as it's traveling towards the listener, and a sudden drop in pitch as it transitions to moving away from the listener. You might have also noticed that the sound is audible over a pretty large distance, meaning it must be fairly loud, and that it has a somewhat complex sonic signature. It's not just a simple whoosh or swish, but rather a messy noise with a screech on top. Let's have a look at where all of this is coming from. Generally speaking, larger objects tend to create louder and lower-pitched noises than smaller objects as they travel through the air. The larger and faster the object, the more air is being compressed in a shorter amount of time, and the larger the high and low pressure zones will be. Additionally, larger projectiles oftentimes have a more complex shape than simple bullets, featuring rounded bodies and fins. All these things change the way that the projectile is interacting with the air, as well as how and where the pressure zones are created. This can lead to complex noise compositions, such as the one of the artillery shell we've heard earlier. It's also one of the main reasons why soldiers in the field are able to distinguish the different kinds of shells after a while. The ear picks up on these subtle, and sometimes less subtle, differences depending on shell size and shape. Another important factor is turbulence. Generally, air streams evenly or flows in a laminar manner around an object as it moves through the air. If the object's speed increases too much, the air may stop flowing smoothly and start to flow in a turbulent manner. This can create a distorted, almost screechy sound similar to that of a distant jet engine. The larger an object is, the more prone is it to develop this turbulent flow. Here, listen to this barrel bomb being dropped from a helicopter without exploding. From the sound alone, it's easy to think it originates from a jet flying by, but you can clearly hear how the sound stops suddenly once the barrel impacts. Here is another one of an empty cluster bomb container falling to the ground. And for good measure, some actual bombs during a training exercise. Now, let's talk about the implications of the speed of sound. A subsonic projectile moves slower than the speed of sound, but that could mean anything from barely moving to very close to the speed of sound. This has huge implications for a potential reaction time, and to demonstrate this, we'll stick with larger projectiles such as mortar and artillery shells for now. We've already established that these can be fairly loud and audible over a large distance. The speed of sound is roughly 340 meters per second, and, depending on manufacturers, an artillery shell shot at a bit of an arc can go from anywhere between 200 and 300 meters per second. This means that a shell flying towards a listener will only become audible after the shell itself has already traveled a large distance and closed in on them. Because of that, the quote-unquote fade-in of the projectile noise will usually be fairly fast, while the sound of the shell traveling away from the listener will be a lot longer. A noteworthy example for all of what we've just discussed so far is the following clip. Pay attention to the change in pitch.
Incoming.
As you can hear, there is a noticeable gradual increase in pitch at first, and only shortly before we can hear the impact, there is a sudden drop in pitch again.
Incoming.
The time between this drop in pitch and the explosion is barely 100 milliseconds, which tells us that the shell impacted just after it passed the listener, very close by. But I want to focus on what the initial rise in pitch tells us. Technically, an increase in velocity could also result in a higher pitch, but it's unlikely that the shell sped up this much. So, something must be going on with the Doppler effect. Remember, the more direct something is moving towards the listener, the higher the perceived pitch will be. From this, we can deduct that this artillery shell was likely fired from relatively far away and approached from a steeper angle. Let me explain. If a cannon fires at something somewhat close, the angle of the gun can be fairly shallow, meaning the pitch of the approaching projectile noise wouldn't shift too much on its way towards the listener. But the further away the target, the larger the angle the gun will fire at. This, in turn, results in the projectile flying in an arc, meaning its angle relative to the listener will change a lot more over time, which is what we're hearing in the video.
Incoming.
We'll conclude our subsonic chapter by going over projectile deflections and ricochets. A deflection happens when a projectile touches the surface at an angle, resulting in a deviation from its original flight path while keeping its general direction and most of its momentum. There are two things to look, or better, listen out for. First, the moment the projectile touches the ground. Many projectiles will have a certain spin on them. When they touch the ground at a shallow angle, a lot of friction is created for a very short amount of time. Especially on softer surfaces, this can be audible as a somewhat loud zip. Chances are that the projectile itself will get slightly deformed from the contact and, at lower speeds, start to tumble. This can change its sound flying through the air from a clean swish to more of a twirl. Ricochets basically take deflections to the extreme. A ricochet is a bullet that struck a surface and changed its flight path entirely, usually losing a lot of momentum in the process. A ricochet will likely be heavily deformed and have an erratic flight path, as its uneven shape makes it prone to quickly rotating through the air. This erratic rotation creates what most people already know as the classic ricochet sound. Alright, let's take a breather and summarize our findings about subsonic projectiles. Subsonic projectiles create sound by displacing air, forming high pressure zones in front and low pressure zones behind them, resulting in characteristic whoosh or whizz noises. Faster projectiles generate louder and higher pitched sounds, with the Doppler effect causing pitch shifts, higher when approaching and lower when receding. Larger objects, like artillery shells, produce louder, lower pitched and more complex noises due to their size, speed and aerodynamic shapes. Turbulence and airflow, which is common at high speeds or with large objects, adds screechy or distorted sounds similar to a jet engine. The fade-in of a projectile noise will usually be faster than the fade-out, because the projectile will usually have already traveled quite a distance before it becomes audible. Deflections create audible friction noises and may cause projectiles to tumble, altering their flight sound. Ricochets are basically more extreme deflections and result in erratic flight paths and deformation, which produces the classic ricochet sound due to uneven rotation. Now, all of this was about subsonic projectiles. But most bullets usually go supersonic, meaning faster than the speed of sound. Some words about the speed of sound from the get-go. First and foremost, the speed of sound is not a constant. When giving examples, the number of 340 meters per second is often used, but it really depends on the humidity and temperature of the air. And that's the next point. When we say speed of sound, we usually talk about the speed of sound in the air. But sound can also travel through objects and liquids, and each of them will have their own speed of sound. But let's not digress. With that out of the way, let's dig in. We've already heard various noises that subsonic projectiles can produce. So let's listen to a SuperSonic 7.62 bullet. Well, that sounds very different, right? Almost like a small caliber gunshot. So, what's going on? We've discussed that projectiles compress and displace air, creating pressure waves. But at some point, the projectile will move faster than the air can make way, and the speed of sound marks this threshold. The pressure waves effectively pile up and form a shock wave. When this shock wave hits us, we perceive it as a loud, explosive, snappy sound, which is commonly referred to as a sonic boom. When talking about bullets in particular, the term bullet crack has also established itself. And let me tell you, it is loud. Even a regular rifle bullet's sonic boom can create levels between 135 and 150 decibels, way above the pain threshold. When I experienced bullet cracks for the first time, I was lying behind the berm, roughly 2 meters below the projectile's trajectory. Curiosity got the better of me, so I took off my ear protection on one ear and was immediately rewarded with a sharp pain and instant tinnitus.
Oh, no, you need the ear protection, man.
Generally speaking, the faster the projectile, the louder and high-pitched the sonic boom will be. Here are 2 recordings of the same bullet, one from the 250 meter and one from the 500 meter mark. The microphones used were not identical, but it's enough to hear the drop in pitch between 250 and 500 meters due to the bullet's lower velocity. And just like the subsonic swoosh, larger projectiles at the same speed will create a louder, lower-pitched sonic crack. But there is more to it. A lot more. The word bullet crack or sonic boom suggests a singular something. But every object going supersonic actually creates 2 shock waves. The front, or bow, shock wave is the one we've talked about. But there's another, the tail shock wave. It is created from the sudden change in pressure when the airflow, compressed by the bow shock, is suddenly released as it passes by the end of the object. This second shock wave is usually a bit quieter than the one to the front. When a small object, such as a bullet, passes us, those 2 shock waves are so close together that we perceive them as a singular sound. But as the literal distance between them increases, they are a lot easier to listen to separately. Here, this is a recording of 2 SpaceX Falcon Heavy approaching with supersonic speed. You can clearly hear how each of them has 2 well-audible sonic booms.
double sonic booms.
Or, more recently, the Starship. However, for the sake of simplicity, I'll just continue calling it supersonic boom or bullet crack. Now, let's dive a bit deeper into how supersonic booms work. A common misconception is that the supersonic boom is a singular event that happens the moment an object becomes faster than the speed of sound. But that's not how it works. The shock waves are continuously created as long as the object travels with supersonic speed, meaning it is constantly emitting this very loud noise. Maybe you're asking now why it sounds like a single bang, so let's have a look. We know that whatever emits the noise is traveling faster than sound, which means we won't hear it approaching, in turn meaning the noise will appear in an instant. But it will also travel away at a very high speed, meaning the perceived volume of the noise will become a lot quieter in a very short amount of time as the distance to the object increases. This sudden appearance and extremely quick increase in distance is why we perceive it as a bang, even though it's actually more of a stream of noise. Naturally, the sound will bounce off the environment as well. A great example of this is a video of French troops in Afghanistan firing towards the mountains. You can clearly hear how the ongoing sonic boom noise is reflected off the mountain to the right. Another thing worth mentioning is the way supersonic booms spread. If the object is moving at exactly the speed of sound, the generated shockwave will form a 90-degree angle relative to its motion. This is sometimes referred to as the Mach wall. As the speed of the object increases, however, the angle becomes steeper, resulting in a cone-shaped spread fittingly called the Mach cone. This can lead to some interesting scenarios. Let's assume someone shoots with a downward angle from an elevated position and there are multiple listeners below him. This is the flight path of the projectile, and this is the cone spread of the bullet crack. In this scenario, all listeners would hear the bullet crack at the same time from the same position because the same shockwave hits them all at the same time. Pretty wild stuff. Alright, so far we've talked about what happens if a supersonic projectile passes you. But there are two other interesting scenarios. On the one hand, the projectile could become subsonic on the way towards the listener. On the other hand, the still supersonic projectile could impact before it actually reaches the listener. What happens to the bullet crack? First and foremost, we have to realize that both scenarios basically describe the same thing. The projectile becomes slower than the speed of sound. It's just that going subsonic during flight is a smooth transition, while a sudden stop is a very, very sudden transition. Let's recall that sound is nothing but energy moving through the air in the form of vibrations. If the projectile goes subsonic, either smoothly or suddenly, the energy of the already generated shockwaves doesn't just disappear. Instead, they continue to propagate until they've lost their energy. If the impact happened very close to you, it still pretty much sounds like a regular, very loud bullet crack. I can personally vouch for that because I was lying in a ditch a few meters behind the impact points. Finally, let's have a more practical look at bullet cracks, starting with a somewhat obvious but important aspect. As the name suggests, supersonic projectiles fly faster than the speed of sound. This means that the projectile will travel faster than the sound of the actual gunshot, resulting in the fact that the listener that is getting shot at will first hear the bullet crack and then the actual shot. And then there is the saying that using a suppressor on a rifle doesn't do much as long as you're using supersonic ammunition, because the bullet crack will still be audible. Is that true? Yesn't. In reality, it highly depends on the angle and distance. If you stand anywhere behind the shooter, the bullet crack and its reflections will reach you at the same time as the shot and be clearly locatable. But as soon as you stand in front of the shooter, the time at which the sound of the shot and the bullet crack reach you start to separate, and distance is key here. We've discussed before that rifles with a larger caliber are still very loud, but especially when shooting at larger distances, this might well make the difference between having a clearly locatable report and a more subtle thud, which might be easier to overhear, especially when the bullet crack's energy still reverberates around. And that was bullet cracks. Again, a little summary. Supersonic projectiles create a loud bullet crack, or sonic boom, due to continuous shock waves that form when the air in front of the projectile can't make way fast enough. Technically, there is a bow and a tail shock wave, but those two only become audible as separate booms for larger objects. We perceive a single sonic boom, but the shockwaves are created continuously. The faster the projectile, the louder and higher pitched the bullet crack. The larger the projectile, the louder and lower pitched the bullet crack. Sonic booms spread in a cone shape. With narrower angles, the faster the projectile travels. When getting shot at, the bullet and therefore the bullet crack will be audible before the actual gunshot, as it outpaces the shot's sound. Shockwaves persist after the projectile slows to subsonic speeds or impacts, dissipating their energy as sound. And that was it! My ultimate guide to gunfire and projectile audio. I hope you found the watch interesting and have learned a thing or two. If you did, the thing that would make me the happiest is to simply share the video with other people you think might be interested. So, thanks, and have a good one.